This is the panel you've been waiting for all week. Just a quick show of hands. How many of you know somebody, friend, family, colleague, yourself, who's had an extraordinary life experience with a psychedelic journey? Mm-hmm. So maybe half. Wow, that's more than I expected. I think next year it's going to be more like 90% because of how rapidly this field is evolving. So we actually are going to do a traditional panel, but we're very, very interested in your feedback because we as a team and as an initiative have had to pivot very recently since the time we scheduled this panel, and Jeannie's going to speak to that. But what we'll do is we'll start off first, well, I'll say for myself, I flew to Stockholm about 12 years ago to visit a friend who had lifelong depression, who was in the depths of despair, to help pull him out of it, and temporary benefit. But 5 years later, he had 3 treatments with ketamine, and he has not had a single day of depression since then after a lifetime of depression. And you've heard about MDMA and PTSD. So this is, I think, one of the greatest breakthroughs in medical therapeutics, certainly in my career. But so what we're going to do is Guy is going to give his personal experience, which is really profound and moving. Jeannie's going to talk about the initiative. And Dietrich is going to talk about some of the things that he's learned in bringing new pharmaceuticals to market over and over again. So Guy, please take it away.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for everyone being here. I'm going to tell you a tale of 2 stories here. And I'm not going to talk about the medicine itself because that's very personal, but I will tell you what my life was like before, and I'll tell you what my life is like today. I served in the military and the Navy for 24 years. The majority of that time I was a SEAL. In my infinite wisdom, when I retired, I decided to become a firefighter paramedic. My wife was like, "What are you crazy?" I'm like, well, I felt like that the karmic load that I had of taking lives, now I can save lives. That worked well for me for the first 5 or 6 years, and then I had a complete mental breakdown to the point where I wanted to take my own life. What got me into the hot seat of being a SEAL in the first place was a litany of childhood adversity, and I say that mildly, but I had physical abuse, emotional abuse, I had neglect, abandonment, betrayal from my parents. All that really kind of armored me up. I decided when I was 6 years old, my dad was beating my mom up, that I was going to armor myself up and I was going to create a sword and I was going to protect myself because this world is a dangerous place. And I'll never forget that moment when I was hiding behind the couch. And I say this because, yeah, this is my unique story, but it's a story that a lot of us have had to deal with, especially in the services. And but everyone deals with trauma at varying degrees. So I leveraged my trauma, again, to put my armor on, to develop a very sharp sword, and it served me well in the military. As far as being a SEAL, the idea of control and dominate the world around you, that was easy because I put it all in place. And I always said that I was way more comfortable being on the battlefield than I was on my own couch because I couldn't stop the chaos around me. And so I would seek out leaving the house. I didn't have connections with my kids. I have 2 boys that one's in college now and one's still in high school. I didn't have any connections with them. I didn't have connections with my spouse. I was abusive to my dog. The very one thing that was giving me love when I got back from Afghanistan, I knew I wasn't ever going to beat my kids like I was beat by my dad. So I took it out on the dog. That's how bad I had become, right, in this story that I was living. I could say this now, because I'm on the other end of it. I did have a very profound experience with psychedelic-assisted therapy. Again, I won't go into details of the medicine and all that. I always tell individuals and other veterans that are interested in going into psychedelics, it's not the easy button. That it's going to give you space to transform yourself into a different human being. I see the world completely different. It's not the same world. And it's funny, the science says something about changing the world. You don't need to change the world. What we need to do is change ourselves. I need to change me. I need to change my perspective of the world. In my life now, it's filled with love and connections. I say that I had to have this self-love, right? Because of what I went through as a child, I was defective. I was the one that was broken. It wasn't my parents, it was me. And I took that on as my energy and the way I went amongst the world. But now that I'm free of that story, where the psychedelic assisted therapy allowed me to break free of that old story. And now I get to create a new story. And I am so grateful for what I have today. And I'm so grateful that I get to share this with other human beings. The possibility, right? We are not going to change the world by changing that which is outside of us. I cannot change or control anything outside of me. I can only change what's inside of me. And that's the things that I've learned so deeply with medicine and moving forward. So I appreciate your time, and yeah, that's my story.
Jeannie told me she hates introducing herself, and that's largely because she's impossible for anybody to introduce. A physician, a scientist, a philanthropist, a visionary, a tech person, and she had the vision that it's time that we get a solid scientific basis to do personalized medicine and apply it to psychedelic therapy. So Jeannie, please tell your story.
Well, thank you, John, and it's a pleasure meeting you, and thank you, Barrett, for including me, and John for inviting me and to allow me to bring some of my teammates here. I can overwhelm you with some scientific data and information, but I want to just pause for a moment and ask each one of you, how many of you have feelings of depression and anxiety, of hopelessness? How many in your family are struggling with what we call mental health and addiction, and certainly amongst your friends? And I'd just like to have a show of hands on that. I want to know you who don't raise your hand, because everybody that I have met is either personally suffering or dealing with stuff their loved ones are, and certainly in our community. And that's really the heart of what is driving me, is that I can take science and medicine and build a program how to implement change using existing systems and then modifying them. It became really clear to me when I call myself a frontier wave surfer. I'm always looking on the edge of the wave of the known and the unknown and the medical applications, the unmet needs. I've been a neuroscientist for 20 years, and I worked on ALS when my mother was diagnosed. I was at the Burnham Institute down in San Diego, and I was fortunate to meet Dietrich a number of decades ago when we were both working on neurodegenerative diseases, and he's an extraordinary biotech entrepreneur. I was blessed with getting involved with the first of its kind in the country about stem cell research. And maybe many of you here in this room from California, back in 2004, we launched an initiative to fund embryonic stem cell research. As a scientist working on a therapeutic for ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, I was using stem cells to derive motor neurons, human motor neurons, in a dish. And when George Bush put a moratorium on stem cell research for political reasons, and I watched the funding completely stop. And it stopped so badly that if you were conducting research and you got a philanthropist to donate money, and if you were conducting research in a laboratory that was funded by the NIH, the facility could lose that funding. I had a problem with that. So fortunately, there was a force of nature here, Robert Klein in Silicon Valley, and I share this with you because not too many people know about it, but he launched what is called a citizen-driven ballot initiative. And it was the stem cell initiative. And he believed that because he was working with scientists at Stanford, and all of his scientists said, there's promise here, there's promise for therapies. So we launched a citizen-driven ballot initiative, Prop 71, and I was involved with the campaign. I would educate doctors and patient advocates and policymakers. I didn't think it would pass. It was a $3 billion bond initiative in an equally challenging economic environment. But in 2004, the voters of California overwhelmingly approved this initiative and created the first of its kind in the world, and it is still the largest of the kind in the world at $3 billion. I was honored to serve as a founding board member of that agency where we developed a new model. We were charged with expediting bench-to-bedside research. And how did we do? At the end of 15 years, when the money ran out, we had 2 FDA-approved therapeutics, 9 fast-track and breakthrough therapeutics, importantly, 60 compounds in the pipeline. We generated 55,000 new jobs in California and brought 50 new companies. In essence, we helped build the foundation of the regenerative medicine space. Went back to the voters in 2020 during the height of the pandemic, and the voters approved an additional $5.5 billion. So it's a vote of confidence that actually a state agency can deliver on its promise. So as I became aware of the really promising clinical trial results from our top academic institutions, looking at psychedelic-assisted therapy, and for those that you don't know, it is mostly talk therapy with 1, 2, or 3 times with the medicine space where you're supervised and facilitated. And it's during these clinical trials that they take patients who are treatment resistant. And the case with the veteran community was, on average, 2 decades that these patients were suffering from trying all traditional therapies, including Guy. He went through the VA healthcare problem, he went through the fire department's healthcare thing and still stuck. So they took these patients and female rape victims and they gave them MDMA with this talk therapy, and this is what you're hearing out in the news these days. The second phase clinical trial confirmed the data on the first, which was 67% of those after the trial reported a significant reduction in their symptoms of PTSD, and importantly, a year later, 70% no longer qualified as having the diagnosis of PTSD. And these patient trials were on the order of 350 patients to 400 patients. So in the world of therapeutics, you don't see those kinds of outcomes that are long-standing. Okay, so it brought to my attention, I thought, what do I do here? And I started looking in the space, doing due diligence. I too am an investor. I am big on due diligence, and I looked in this space, and I recognized 2 things that are a problem here. One, they're Schedule I medicines based off of a political belief system from Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. 2, importantly, they're not patentable. These medicines have been around mankind for tens, if not even up to 100,000 years. So the pharmaceutical companies haven't gotten involved because they can't protect their financial investment. But it doesn't mean that this is not a therapy that should be brought to the public. So we launched about a year ago, almost not a year ago, a citizen-driven ballot initiative here in California called Treat California. And the focus of Treat was to bring psychedelic medicine safely and responsibly. This is not a decrim movement, and it's not a legalization movement. But it was to fund treatments, clinical trials following safety and efficacy, research, basic research that's coming out of our top academic institutions is nothing short of extraordinary. Education, need to train therapists properly. We need to educate the public. Access, it became really important to me that everybody needs access to these therapeutics, not just the rich. And new therapies. So we launched this initiative, and remarkably so, one of my greatest gifts in life is attracting extraordinary human beings to work together. And the team that I am so grateful for are a collection of highly accomplished, competent, extraordinary persons who want to leave a change on the world. And feeling and believing that the mental health care crisis in our country is nothing short of a true epidemic. And I can go through stats for you, but we all know how awful it is. And so we launched the initiative. I've formed this coalition. I've got one of the best campaign managers in the country. We quickly assimilated 2,800 volunteers within a couple of months. We reached the veteran community. The college kids are really into this. I was able to secure many of the unions. I received the first endorsement from the Firefighters Union. It was the first in union history, and the postal workers unions. I went in front of the major unions in our country, and each one of them spoke to them as they're human beings and they're all suffering too. So it's the first time that they collectively came together to support this. We recently polled, we got our title and summary, and our title and summary was posed in the most unfavorable light to the voters of California, and it was creating another government agency with bonds for psychedelic research using LSD. And by the way, it's going to cost you $6.6 billion. And after our polling, recognizing that the funding that was required to be successful with this campaign is on the order of about $50 million. And I was a third of the way into that and recognized that I don't have the funding to continue to run a really successful campaign. So we're withdrawing from the campaign, but we're not withdrawing from the mission. And part of why I'm here today is to ask advice from you. John has shared with me about what an incredible group of change makers you are in the audience. And before we go into the dialogue on it, I just want to pass it over to my dear friend here, Dietrich, and have him share a little bit of his perspective, and then perhaps we can go into some dialogue about some of the issues that we have faced in this process, including fundraising, and just open up the discussion.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. What a beautiful venue by the ocean. I think my job here on the panel is to bring the perspective of the biotech establishment to the table and perhaps put psychedelics into context for the audience. And I think the reason that that's useful is because psychedelics come with a lot of baggage, historical baggage that was foisted on it probably in the 80s by the federal government, that they're bad, they're recreational, they're federally illegal. There's a stigma associated with it. And I think there's also a stigma, I know there's a stigma associated with mental health and well-being. And so I do think it's useful to put it in context and not let that dominate the conversation. So just by way of personal introduction, I don't like it when people get sick and die, and I can tell you why, but that's been my motivation over the last 30 years. And I took it upon myself to figure out how to diagnose if the human machine is going awry very early, because generally early detection equals better outcomes. And when a part is going wrong in the human machine, how we can either bolster that part or refabricate it and replace it. The body is just a machine, just like every other machine, albeit the most complex one we'll probably ever encounter. And so presented myself to and became part of the Human Genome Project to decipher the 3 billion letter genetic code. Helped build and run genome institutes across the country to sift through the molecular makeup of people with and without diseases and see what was systematically different. Then went and helped build the infrastructure at the national and global level to deliver molecular diagnostics to patients and physicians so that they could get access to that information, and information is power and act on it. Early diagnosis equals better therapies. And now that we have at least some understanding of the human machine, at least the pathogenic insults that undergird most rare and common diseases, how do you begin to fix those? And I think that's the era of genetic medicine that we're in that's so exciting. And so that's my contextual framework for putting psychedelics, slotting that psychedelics into that framework, and have done 30 plus companies, have a lot of therapies on the market as a result of that activity. And so kind of went deep is what I'm trying to tell you, and it was all kind of the establishment, right? I have never, ever seen molecules that have the safety profile of these molecules. I mean, they've been in people for hundreds, if not thousands of years in some cases, think about a clinical trial with 300 people that we run through the FDA and stamp it with a safety approval stamp, and that have the efficacy profile. I mean, we could really use the word cures for some of the diseases that Jeannie and Guy mentioned. And yet, they're not in the mainstream. We're not using them. If I in my sort of establishment life stumbled on a molecule like this, it would be game over. I'd be a trillionaire. People would be singing and dancing in the streets, and yet here we have this stuff, and it's not being driven into the mainstream. And we have to ask ourselves, why not? Are we looking at it with clear eyes, or are we looking at it through some stigmatized lens? And I think it's incumbent on us, given the transformational efficacy that you've heard about, to think about it, and think about it with clear eyes, try and drive it into the mainstream. And it's not just about mental illness, it's about mental health, right, and perspective building, and geopolitics, and economics, and everything else. And so, anyway, we shouldn't think about this as woo-woo sort of nonsense. This is real medicine, and we should treat it that way.
I just want to add something that Jeannie tapped into is I tried everything. I did. And I went to the VA. I went to the fire service. And literally, I had to retire because there was no hope, and I had to leave my own country to get access to these medicines. It's just sad. It really is a sad place when we, the people, right, can step up and say, hey, this is working. Right? There are things that are working on this, and create a whole new model of therapy that's behind it. Because this isn't about necessarily the medicine, it's about the therapy and the model of how we deliver this to the people that need it the most. And giving like Jeannie's saying, it's giving the access. I was lucky that I had connections to be able to go down to Mexico and do this. Not every veteran has that. So it's just something to think about.
I want to add some staggering statistics if you aren't aware. There are 41 suicides and self-inflicted harms in our veteran community a day. A day. Suicide is now the second leading cause of death amongst our firefighters. Second leading cause of death amongst our firefighters. First responders are more likely to die of suicide than they are on the job. Our children, I'm a mother of 5, and I really believe our futures are our children. Never before in the history, 40% of our adolescents, aged 18 to 27, are experiencing feelings of helplessness. 20% have considered suicide, and 10% have attempted suicide. Those are staggering. I didn't grow up. I was lucky. We grew up in this age of we put man on the moon, and we bring technology, and we're gonna, it's like this age of possibilities. And I think about the kids. God, you all have kids or grandkids, and this is what they're suffering. It's like, wait, we have to change. The system is broken. The homelessness. There isn't. You pick any sector you want, and it's impacted by this mental health care crisis. And the system that we have now is broken. And stupidity to me is keep on doing the same thing, expecting a different outcome. So I'm like, hello. So we want to bring these medicines safely, within the construct of the medical paradigm, tracking outcomes, tracking safety, tracking long-term outcomes. I want to use AI as we collect data. We want to gene sequence every participant opting in, do all the proteomics, metabolomics, include in this bioinformatics data bank the wearable devices and the apps that are being developed now to engage people, and engage them so that we're helping develop positive patterns of behavior. And we put this in this bioinformatic data bank, and it's cyber secure, but we make it open access. for the world, for those smart people out there who can use some machine language and find some correlation with the phenotypic expression, meaning depression, anxiety, multiple substance use disorder, complex PTSD, and overlay that in this data bank so we can start predicting and improving outcomes. And outcomes in this case, you can talk about the diagnosable criteria of the DSM-5, anxiety, depression, all these things, but it also includes well-being. We can be the most successful people in our lives. You can make all this money in the world, and I ask you, are you happy? How is your relationship with your children? Are you connected really with the people around you that you love? And I'm not judging you, I'm just suggesting that there are ways to connect to one's emotions, to take agency over it. And I believe in it, giving people tools, giving people an example. We learn from each other by modeling, by learning, by reading, by hearing stories. And we don't have any good examples of leaders of modeling this kind of behavior because it's just not there. And in part, it's contributing to this continuous cycle, and it's not looking great. And yes, you're here, this technology, which is wonderful, and I believe in technology. I believe in technology to help us be better. But it is not the solution. It doesn't cure everything because you still have humans. And humans are really complex people. And we have to learn to come together. I go, one of the things I talk about, treat California, and it is now treat humanity. We have to come together and help each other. This tribalism, this me, I hear you. But we need now, and it's now, we need to come together to serve each other. And it's not just in mental health and well-being, and I have a strong support for the climate change issue. Because you can take somebody and give them some good mental health tools and you drop them in this toxic environment and it just doesn't matter. They don't have a chance. They just don't have a chance. We've got 2 billion people on this planet who don't have clean drinking water. We have wars everywhere and this migration of, it's the chaos. And so we have to address the climate change. Concomitantly, same time, we have to address some of these other issues, and I believe mental health, and I say mental health not as the diagnosable ones, because we all are a product of our mental health and our well-being. And if we don't address how to improve that amongst each other, what are we doing?
And we've just got a couple minutes left, but I'd like to add to these brilliant expositions of the problem we're trying to solve, that the polling that was done on the ballot initiative, we're seeing progress because the term psychedelic, the term LSD was not what led to the adverse polling. What led to the adverse polling was state agency. We're in a zeitgeist right now of enormous distrust of public institutions. And so we're pivoting from Treat California and a ballot initiative to Treat Humanity. And what we'd like to see from this audience is your thoughts on, as we're pivoting to a new way of funding this multi-omics, multimodality kind of discovery, which has been the grist of a lot of the talks throughout this conference, as we want to scale the research in ways where what frustrates me immensely is, because I read extensively in Cell, Nature, Science, PNAS, how many times the NIH has funded studies that never should have been funded because they're so methodologically flawed or they're not powered adequately with enough subjects to really reach meaningful conclusions. So what we're looking for from all of you, and these wonderful people are going to be here through dinner, and any of you who have any ideas, we're entertaining lots of different strategies, but we believe, if not us, who, if not now, when, that this is the time to really not only overcome some of the barriers left from the Timothy Leary legacy, but also overcome some of the limitations of our current scientific funding mechanisms, which more and more people are recognizing as broken. I'm certainly one of them that views way too many studies are funded that should have never been funded. And how do we do it properly in ways that really deliver value for money that can be scaled and address some of these issues with the rise in anxiety, depression, PTSD that we're seeing globally. So I'd like to invite everybody in the audience to approach Jeannie and any member of this panel with any ideas you have throughout the rest of today, because we are recalculating, pivoting, and finding the new path, but by no means giving up on pursuing this initiative. So thank you all very much, and please approach these fine panelists throughout the rest of the day, and let's give them a round of applause. Thank you.